That dam protected 7 families. My father built it 40 years ago with his own hands. I'd spent months filing permits, legal notices, certified letters, every single thing the system asked me to do. She ignored all of it. She hired a private excavator, showed up with a board resolution signed by 3 people, and had the whole structure gone in 43 minutes. No county permit, no warning to the neighbors downstream, nothing. When she saw me walk out my front door, she rolled down her window and said,
"You should have done this the easy way, Sterling."
I didn't say a word back. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and let her keep digging. She had no idea that excavator just dug her own grave. What would you do in my shoes? Drop where you're watching from. To understand why that dam mattered so much, you need to understand where I come from. My name is Sterling Voss. I'm 54 years old, semi-retired civil engineer, hobby farmer, and the kind of guy who owns a transit level and actually knows how to use it. I bought 5 acres on the low end of Harrowfield Estates about 12 years ago, a mixed-income HOA community tucked into the Ozark foothills of southwestern Missouri, the kind of place where you can still hear coyotes at night and smell rain coming 20 minutes before it arrives. The property has a seasonal creek running across the back corner. Muddy Fork, the locals call it. Beautiful in July, maybe 8 inches deep, clear enough to see crawdads on the bottom. Dangerous in March, when the snowmelt comes off the ridge and that 8-inch trickle turns into a 4-foot wall of brown water, moving faster than you'd believe. My father understood that. He bought this land before I was born, and the first thing he did, before he put in a garden, before he built the workshop, before he did anything else, was dig a drainage swale along the low side of the property and build an earthen berm to redirect Muddy Fork's overflow away from the houses below. He did it with a borrowed bulldozer, a case of beer, and 2 weekends of work that left him barely able to walk on Monday morning. He called it practical. I call it the reason 7 families never had water in their living rooms. I reinforced that berm myself about 8 years ago, rented an excavator, spent a long Saturday in red clay up to my boot tops, the smell of turned earth so thick you could taste it. My son Travis handed me water bottles from the tailgate and told me I was going to throw my back out. He wasn't wrong, but the berm held, and every spring since, Muddy Fork did exactly what my father intended. Ran high, hit the swale, redirected, and bothered nobody. That was the situation when Constance Aldridge Plum became HOA board president. Constance is a real estate heiress from a family that made its money in commercial property development across 3 states. She moved into Harrowfield Estates 6 years ago, bought the largest house in the development, a 6,200 square foot colonial sitting at the top of the hill, and within 18 months had maneuvered herself onto the HOA board, then into the president's chair, where she'd remained ever since through a combination of parliamentary procedure and the particular social pressure that comes from being the most intimidating person in any given room. She had a gift for the HOA rulebook, specifically for finding things in it that applied to people she didn't like. A retired school teacher 2 doors down got a formal violation notice for a flagpole. A young family on the east cul-de-sac, 3 kids, one of whom uses a wheelchair, had their fence permit rejected twice. A black family across the street applied for a backyard shed permit the same month as 2 white families on the west side. The white families got approved in 2 weeks. The black family waited 7 months and were ultimately denied. Constance never put anything ugly in writing. She didn't have to. She just ran the meetings, controlled the votes, and smiled at everyone equally. That particular smile that says, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and there's nothing you can do about it." Then she found my berm. She sent a formal HOA violation notice, citing Article 7, Section 3 of the CC&Rs, unapproved landscape modification, 30 days to remove it or face $150 daily fines. The berm, according to her notice, was unauthorized. The berm my father built before the HOA even existed. I read that letter twice, set it down on the kitchen table, and started making phone calls. The first thing I did was exactly what a reasonable person does when a bureaucrat comes after something that's rightfully theirs. I went and got the paperwork. I pulled the original county deed, the one with my father's name on it, dated 1974. I pulled the plat map showing the property boundaries and the drainage easement. And then I called the county engineer's office and asked a simple question. Does anyone over there have a record of this drainage structure? Turns out they did. A signed letter from a county drainage engineer, filed in 1987, formally acknowledging the Voss property berm as a permitted stormwater control structure, serving multiple downstream lots. My father had been thorough. Of course he had. Travis, my son, who at this point was deep into his second year of environmental law at Mizzou, helped me draft the rebuttal. We cited Missouri Revised Statute 442.015, which protects pre-existing drainage infrastructure from HOA interference when that infrastructure serves a documented stormwater management function for adjacent properties. Plain English version: if your drainage structure was there before the HOA and it protects your neighbors, the HOA cannot simply vote it away. That's your first practical takeaway, and write it down somewhere. Pre-existing infrastructure with documented county recognition is legally defensible against HOA removal orders, but only if you can prove it existed and what it does. I hand-delivered the rebuttal to the HOA management office on a Thursday afternoon. Certified mail receipt, return signature required. The woman at the front desk looked at the envelope like I'd handed her a live fish. 3 weeks later, the board voted 4-1 to reject my appeal. Constance chaired the meeting. She did not allow me to speak. When I raised my hand during the public comment period, which, per the HOA bylaws, I was entitled to, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said the comment period had been waived due to time constraints. The meeting had been running for 19 minutes. I drove home with the particular cold clarity of a man who understands he's not dealing with a process problem. He's dealing with a power problem. So I changed the playing field. Missouri's Sunshine Law, that's RSMO Chapter 610, requires HOA boards that exercise authority over shared infrastructure to make certain records publicly available upon request. Meeting minutes, voting records, correspondence related to enforcement actions. I filed a formal records request the following Monday morning. They had 3 business days to comply. They complied. Reluctantly, but they complied. I posted the minutes, redacted only for personal addresses, to the neighborhood's public Facebook group. No commentary, no editorial, just the documents, a brief description of what they were, and a note that I'd be happy to answer questions. I went to bed expecting maybe 5 or 6 neighbors to see it by morning. I woke up to 47 comments. 14 homeowners shared their own stories. The flagpole teacher, the family with the wheelchair ramp, the shed situation on the east cul-de-sac, 3 more families I hadn't even heard of. It turned out Constance had been running Harrowfield Estates like a private kingdom for so long that people had simply stopped expecting anything different, until someone actually put the evidence in front of them in black and white. That Facebook post stayed up for exactly 31 hours before Constance called an emergency board session and moved to ban me from all HOA digital platforms. The motion passed 3-2. One of the 2 dissenting votes was a board member named Gerald Pike, a retired electrician who had apparently been waiting 2 years for someone to make this particular fight worth having. More on Gerald later. But here's the thing about banning someone from a Facebook group in the year of our Lord. The screenshots were already everywhere. 3 other neighborhood groups, 2 local community pages. Someone had even posted the enforcement pattern comparison, my berm versus the shed denials, to a statewide HOA accountability forum that apparently had 11,000 members. Constance had spent 19 minutes refusing to let me speak at a board meeting. In return, 11,000 strangers were now reading about her voting record. I'd like to say I felt satisfied. Mostly I just felt tired, and a little worried about the weather forecast I'd seen that morning. A slow-moving storm system was building somewhere out over Kansas, and Muddy Fork had been running high for a week. But that worry could wait. We were just getting started. When you can't win the argument, some people find another gear. Constance found hers about 10 days after the Facebook incident. The HOA management company, a firm out of Springfield called Pinnacle Property Solutions, which I had started to think of as Constance's administrative arm, began issuing daily fines starting on day 31 of my original violation notice. $150 a day, every day, regardless of the fact that my legal challenge was technically still active and unresolved. 2 weeks in, the total was $2,100. The notices came in standard white envelopes with a Pinnacle return address, and they had a particular quality about them: crisp, impersonal, relentless, like getting a parking ticket every morning before you'd even had your coffee. Darlene, my wife, started carrying antacids in her cardigan pocket. She didn't say much about it. She didn't have to. Constance also hired a private inspector, a one-man operation out of Joplin, who produced a single-page report claiming my berm creates an unnatural water diversion that may negatively impact neighboring properties. Which was, technically, true in the same way it's true that a seatbelt creates an unnatural restraint on your body during a car crash. The report was thin, but it was official-looking, and that was the point. What Constance didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she never bothered to look at anything more technical than the CC and Rs, is that I am a civil engineer, a semi-retired one, sure, but the kind of semi-retired that still owns survey equipment and knows exactly what a percolation test is. I spent that next weekend running a full drainage study of my 5 acres and the 3 adjacent lots. Transit level, string line, a rented soil percolation kit, and about 16 hours of work spread over 2 very long days. The smell of wet clay in the morning, the creak of my knees on the 3rd hour of crouching over measurement stakes, Travis periodically appearing with sandwiches, and the expression of a man watching his father do something inadvisable and impressive in equal measure. The data wasn't close. My berm was redirecting Muddy Fork's overflow away from 5 downstream properties, including 2 lots on the east side of the street, and critically, the access road leading to Constance's cul-de-sac. Remove the berm during a significant rain event, and the water didn't just stay on my property. It went looking for somewhere else to go. I hired Dr. Felix Okafor, a licensed hydrologist out of Springfield, to review and certify my study. $800 well spent. Dr. Okafor was the kind of man who spoke in complete sentences and treated every question like it deserved a real answer. And his written assessment contained 1 paragraph I have since committed to memory. Removal of this structure during a precipitation event of 3 inches or more in 24 hours would predictably cause sheet flooding across the lower tier of Harrowfield Estates, with secondary overflow pathways extending to adjacent road infrastructure. Travis and I filed that report with the county engineer's office and the Missouri Department of Natural Resources as a formal infrastructure hazard notice. This is your second practical takeaway. When you're fighting a removal order on a drainage structure, a certified hydrologist's report, filed with the appropriate government agency, transforms a neighbor dispute into an official infrastructure record. And that changes what the authorities are legally required to do next. What they were required to do next was send the HOA board a letter requesting a pause in enforcement pending a county-level drainage review. The county sent that letter on a Wednesday. By Friday, Constance's attorney had responded, claiming the HOA was a private entity, not subject to county oversight on internal enforcement matters, which was, and I want to be precise here, partially true, partially false, and entirely the wrong thing to put in writing when a hydrologist had just told the state government that your enforcement action was a flood risk. Gerald Pike, the dissenting board member, called me that Friday evening. He'd seen the attorney's letter. He sounded like a man who had been holding his breath for a long time and was deciding whether to exhale. "Sterling," he said, "I don't know how this ends, but I want you to know I've got every email they've sent me saved in a folder." I told him to keep saving. Outside, Muddy Fork was running at twice its normal depth. The dogwoods were already blooming, which meant it was warmer than it should have been for March. And up in the watershed, the snowmelt was just getting started. There's a particular kind of opponent who, when they realize they're losing on the facts, pivots to attacking the person. Constance pivoted right around the 3rd week of April. It started at the Harrowfield Estates Spring Social, a catered backyard affair at the home of one of Constance's closer allies, the kind of event where the wine is good and the conversation is carefully managed. I wasn't invited, which was fine, but several of my neighbors were, and what they heard filtered back to me over the following week in pieces, the way bad news always travels. Constance had been telling people I was a litigious nuisance, that I was trying to weaponize the creek for personal financial gain, some vague implication that I stood to benefit professionally from drawing attention to drainage infrastructure issues, given my engineering background. She used the phrase, "the way the neighborhood has improved," more than once, in contexts that had nothing to do with landscaping. That phrase landed differently on the families on the East cul-de-sac. They noticed. They remembered the shed permits. The most direct hit came to my professional life. Constance contacted the regional municipal planning firm I consult with part-time and suggested, in writing, in a letter on HOA stationery, that I was engaged in a conflict of interest by using my professional credentials to challenge an HOA enforcement action. She implied the firm might want to be aware of this before continuing our relationship. My supervisor called me. He was apologetic and slightly bewildered. "Sterling," he said, "I don't even know what she thinks you're doing wrong, but I wanted you to hear it from me first." I thanked him. I kept my voice level. And after I hung up, I sat in my truck in the driveway for about 4 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, feeling the specific chill of learning what someone is willing to do. Then I went inside and made a decision. I went quiet. Completely, strategically, deliberately quiet. I stopped posting, stopped attending HOA meetings. When Constance's management company called, I returned their calls with short, cheerful emails. When neighbors asked what was happening, I told them things were proceeding and I'd have an update soon. I paid the accumulated fines, $2,250 by this point, not because I accepted the debt, but because each payment was sent with a written notation, paid under protest, pending legal resolution. Every check, every time. Paper trail intact. Meanwhile, Travis filed a formal complaint with the Missouri Attorney General's office under the Missouri Human Rights Act. The complaint documented the enforcement pattern: flagpoles, fence permits, shed denials, the specific timing and demographics, and submitted the public records we'd obtained under the Sunshine Law as supporting evidence. Filing a civil rights complaint with a state AG office costs nothing, requires no attorney, and creates an official government record that dramatically raises the stakes of ongoing discriminatory conduct. That's your third practical takeaway. And I started making phone calls to the neighbors who'd commented on that original Facebook post. Not group emails, not announcements, individual calls, one family at a time, sitting at my kitchen table in the evenings while Darlene watched the news in the next room. I asked each family 2 questions. What happened to you? And do you still have the paperwork? Almost all of them did. By the end of the second week, I had a quiet coalition. 7 families, including Horace Dunbar, a retired plumber on the east side, who still had the repair bills from a minor flood event 3 years prior that the HOA had denied any responsibility for, and Yolanda Reyes, a high school science teacher who turned out to have a working rain gauge in her backyard, and the methodical patience of someone who grades lab reports for a living. We didn't announce ourselves. We didn't post anything. We just started documenting. Dated photographs, rainfall measurements, written records of every exchange with the HOA. And then, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood watch for our county. A slow-moving low-pressure system was stalling directly over the Muddy Fork watershed. Forecasters were calling for 3 to 5 inches of rain over 6 hours, possibly beginning as early as the following Tuesday. I looked at that forecast for a long time. Muddy Fork had been running high for 3 weeks. The ground was already saturated. And standing between all that water and 7 families' living rooms was a patch of bare earth where an emergency dam used to be. Well, almost used to be. I hadn't touched it, not yet. It was Travis who found it. He'd been pulling HOA incorporation documents for the AG complaint. The kind of archival work that involves a lot of PDFs, a lot of bad scan quality, and the particular eye strain that comes from reading legal language at midnight. He called me on a Sunday evening, and I could tell from the first 2 seconds of silence that he'd found something. "Dad," he said, "did you know Article 14 exists?" I did not know Article 14 existed. Here is what Article 14, Section 2, Paragraph C of the Harrowfield Estates Original Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, filed in 1998 when the development was first platted, says, in its entirety. No board action shall authorize the removal or material alteration of any drainage infrastructure identified in the original site grading plan if such infrastructure serves a stormwater management function for 2 or more adjacent lots. And here is what Exhibit D of that same declaration, the original site grading plan, attached at filing, apparently never read by anyone in a position of authority in 26 years, contains a labeled drainage feature, called specifically the Voss Drainage Swale, by name, in the HOA's own founding document. Constance's organization had been trying to force me to remove a drainage structure that their own governing documents explicitly protected, for months. with daily fines and private inspectors and letters to my employer, and a resolution signed by 3 board members. I sat at my kitchen table for a long moment after Travis read me that paragraph. The house was quiet. The creak was audible from the back window. It had been running loud for days. Darlene came in, saw my face, and sat down across from me without saying anything. "They didn't read their own rule book," I finally said. "How far does this go?" she asked. I called Ren Castellano the next morning. Ren is a real estate attorney in Springfield who specializes in HOA covenant disputes, and she has the pleasant demeanor of someone who genuinely enjoys finding exactly this kind of thing buried in exactly this kind of document. I could hear her smiling through the phone when I read her the paragraph. Her assessment was direct. If the board proceeded with demolition after you filed a certified hydrology report, after a county drainage review was opened, and after this provision was sitting in their own founding document, that's not just a civil matter, Sterling. That's potentially tortious interference with a recorded infrastructure easement. Board members can face personal liability, not the HOA's insurance, them personally. Let me translate that into plain language, because it matters. An HOA board cannot vote to remove infrastructure that their own founding documents explicitly protect. And if they do it anyway and damage results, individual board members can be held personally financially responsible. Not just the organization. That changes everything. Because HOA boards are used to hiding behind institutional liability. The moment you make it personal, the math changes. I set the document face down on the table. I refilled my coffee. Then I opened a fresh legal pad, drew a line down the middle, and started 2 lists. On the left, everything I had. On the right, everything I still needed. The left column was longer than I expected. The weather forecast that evening had been updated. The slow-moving storm system was now confirmed. 5 inches of rain, possibly more, starting Tuesday. Muddy Fork was going to run. The only question was where. I had some ideas about that. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I did not cause the flood. I did not manipulate the weather. I did not sabotage a single thing. Every action I took from this point forward was legal, documented, and in several cases specifically recommended by licensed professionals. What I did was prepare. And I prepared the way a civil engineer prepares, methodically, thoroughly, and with a very clear understanding of what water does when you stop telling it where to go. First, the dam itself. Because the county drainage review was still technically open and active, the HOA's enforcement order was legally stayed. That meant I was within my rights, not only to leave the berm standing, but to maintain it. I rented a plate compactor and spent a Saturday reinforcing the earthen face, tamping down the surface, adding a layer of riprap stone along the toe for erosion protection, installing a 4-inch PVC overflow pipe with a flap valve at the regulated crest elevation to ensure controlled discharge even at peak flow. The vibration from the compactor traveled up through the soles of my boots and into my knees in a way that reminded me I was 54 years old. I chose to interpret this as character. I also installed 2 trail cameras, weatherproof housings, local SD card recording, motion activated, aimed at the berm from different angles. Both cameras were on my property. Both were aimed at my property. If anyone came near that dam without my knowledge, I would have video of it from 2 directions. Horace Dunbar stopped by on Sunday afternoon and spent 3 hours helping me stake and photograph the entire berm perimeter. Dated photographs, GPS coordinates, the works. Horace is 67, built like a man who spent 40 years in tight crawl spaces, and has a way of working in silence that I find deeply companionable. We didn't talk much, we just documented everything. Second, the coalition. Over 2 weekends, I brought together the 7 neighbor families in my garage. Folding chairs, a coffee urn, a hand-drawn watershed map taped to the pegboard above my workbench. I walked them through the hydrology in plain terms. I showed them Dr. Okafor's report. I showed them the Article 14 clause. Yolanda Reyes sat in the front row with a notebook. She asked better questions than most engineers I've worked with. Horace had already brought his flood repair bills from 3 years prior. $4,800 in crawl space remediation that his homeowner's insurance had covered, but that he'd always suspected shouldn't have been necessary. By the end of the second weekend, Horace and Yolanda had agreed to document their own lots with dated photographs and daily rain gauge readings for as long as the weather watch remained active. 7 families had given Ren Castellano written authorization to include their properties in the legal action if damage occurred. Third, the legal trap. Ren filed a formal cease and desist with the HOA board, citing Article 14, Section 2, Paragraph C, hand-delivered, certified mail, read receipt confirmed. She also filed something called a lis pendens notice against the HOA's common area property. A lis pendens, Latin for suit pending, is a recorded legal notice that tells the world a lawsuit involving a specific property is active. It doesn't shut the HOA down. What it does is make it nearly impossible for them to refinance, borrow against, or leverage their common area assets while the dispute is unresolved. Banks won't touch a property with a lis pendens on it. It's the legal equivalent of putting a boot on someone's car. They can still sit in it, they just can't drive anywhere useful. Most HOA boards have never heard of it. Constance's board certainly hadn't. Their attorney's response letter, when it came, had the slightly panicked energy of someone who has just learned a rule they didn't know existed. Travis supplemented the AG complaint with the Article 14 discovery. The AG's office upgraded the inquiry to a full investigation. Gerald Pike called me the evening after Ren's cease and desist was delivered. He said the board had held an emergency session. He said Constance had told them the attorney was handling it. He said 3 of the 4 members who'd voted to enforce the violation order looked like they were reconsidering their life choices. "How long until the storm hits?" he asked. 4 days, I said. Outside, the wind had shifted. The air had that particular flat, green quality that Ozark locals learned to recognize. The smell of a big rain still hours away, but already making its intentions known. The trap was set. All it needed now was patience. Constance blinked first. She just blinked in the wrong direction. 3 days after receiving Ren's cease and desist, 3 days after being formally notified that the HOA's own founding document protected my dam, that a lis pendens had been filed on their common area, and that a state AG investigation was active, Constance contacted a private landscape contractor called Brentford Site Services out of Joplin and scheduled what she described to them as emergency remediation work on an unauthorized earthen obstruction causing drainage problems along a community easement. She scheduled it for Tuesday morning. She did not pull a county permit. She did not notify me. She did not notify the county engineer, whose review was still open. She did not notify the 7 families downstream, whose properties would be directly affected by what she was about to do. She also did not know I work from home. I heard the truck before I saw it, that low diesel rumble of a mini excavator trailer coming up the gravel road, the particular sound that sits in your chest before it reaches your ears. I stepped onto my front porch and watched it pull up to the edge of my property line. A 2-man crew from Brentford, young guys, professional, clearly just doing a job they'd been hired to do. I walked out and introduced myself to the crew foreman, calmly. No raised voice, no dramatics. I asked 2 questions. Did they have a work permit from the county, and were they aware of the lis pendens filed against the HOA's common area easement? The foreman pulled out his phone and made a call. While he was on the phone, I called the county engineer's office. 40 seconds later, I had confirmation. No permit had been pulled for any earthworks activity at this address. Any land disturbance activity on a structure currently subject to an open county drainage review is a violation of Missouri's land disturbance permit requirements, a fact I relayed to the foreman when he got off his call. Ren was already on the phone with the contractor's state licensing board before the foreman had finished processing what I'd told him. The crew idled. The excavator sat. 40 minutes passed, with the specific texture of time moving through wet concrete. Then Constance arrived, white Lexus, moving faster than the HOA parking guidelines technically permitted. She had a copy of the board resolution, signed by 3 members, dated the previous Friday, and she handed it to the foreman with the practiced authority of someone who had been handing pieces of paper to people and watching them comply for a very long time. She turned to me. "You should have done this the easy way, Sterling," she said. "This is what happens when people don't know when to stop." Then she told the foreman to proceed. He looked at the resolution. He looked at his phone, where presumably Ren's call to the licensing board was creating some kind of disruption in his Tuesday. He looked at the excavator. He started the machine. I stepped back to my property stake, the surveyed line, the documented boundary, and I kept recording. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. Watching something being destroyed that you built with your own hands, that your father built before you, that you had every legal right to keep standing, while a woman in expensive shoes stood 20 feet away with her arms crossed, because she had decided that her authority was more real than your rights. The foreman made 4 passes with the bucket. 43 minutes. The berm my father built in 1974, the one I reinforced 8 years ago with sore knees and Travis handing me water bottles, the one the county had on record and the HOA's own founding document protected. Gone. Constance watched until the last pass. Then she got back in her Lexus, looked at me one more time through the window, and drove back up the hill to her Colonial. I stood at my property stake for another few minutes after the truck left. The creek was already audible, louder than usual, moving with the specific urgency of water that knows something is coming. The ground around the breach was raw, red clay, freshly cut, edges sharp in the morning light. I checked the trail camera feeds, both recording, both angles clear. I checked the weather app. The storm system had accelerated slightly. Rain was now expected by early evening. I texted Travis one message. It's tonight. You should probably drive down. I want to tell you exactly what I did after that crew drove away, because I think it matters. I moved my truck and Darlene's car to the high end of the property, the gravel pad near the workshop, a good 6 feet above the seasonal flood line. I called Horace. I called Yolanda. I called Dr. Okafor, who answered on the first ring and said, simply, I saw the weather forecast. I've been waiting for your call. I called Wren, who was already filing. What Wren was filing, specifically, was an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order in Greene County Circuit Court. The motion cited the illegal removal of a documented, covenant-protected drainage structure, the Open County Drainage Review, the certified hydrologist's flood risk assessment, and the imminent weather event as compounding factors creating immediate risk of harm to identifiable residential properties. She filed it at 2:14 p.m. Here is why that timing matters. Filing a legal motion before the damaging event occurs establishes that the risk was known, documented, and officially flagged in advance, which is the difference between a dispute about who caused the flood and an open and shut case of documented negligence. Wren knew that. She'd done this before. Horace went around to his neighbors on the east cul-de-sac and knocked on doors personally, the old-fashioned way, knuckles on wood, to let them know what was coming and suggest they move anything valuable out of their ground floors and crawl spaces. Yolanda set up her rain gauge and started logging readings every 30 minutes, time-stamped, in a composition notebook with the methodical handwriting of someone who has been keeping lab records for 20 years. I checked the trail cameras one more time, both still running. I pulled the SD cards, made copies on my laptop, and put the originals in a waterproof case with the rest of the documentation. Dr. Okafor's report, the Article 14 covenant, the Lis Pendens filing, the certified mail receipts, the county drainage notice, and a printed screenshot of the weather forecast timestamped 6:47 a.m. that morning, the morning before the demolition, the morning when the storm's arrival was already confirmed. The air outside had changed. That petrichor smell, rain on dry pavement coming from the southwest, had been building since mid-afternoon, and by 5 o'clock, it had that particular quality that anyone who grew up in the Ozarks learns to respect. Flat light, greenish sky at the edges, the creek running with a low, purposeful sound that was nothing like its normal summer trickle. Travis arrived at 5:30, driving 4 hours from Columbia without being asked twice. He walked in, looked at the documentation spread across the kitchen table, and said, "Is there coffee?" There was coffee. We didn't talk much. We just waited. It started raining at 6:02 p.m. At 4:47 p.m., 75 minutes before the first drop fell, the HOA's attorney sent Wren a formal email. The subject line was, Harrowfield Estates, Resolution of Violation. The body of the email informed her that the board had successfully completed the remediation of the unauthorized drainage obstruction, considered the matter fully resolved, and looked forward to putting this dispute behind them. 75 minutes before the rain started. I've thought about that email a lot since then. The specific confidence of it. The assumption that removing my dam was the end of the story, rather than the beginning of a very different one. There's something almost poignant about it. A letter declaring victory, sent into the quiet hour before everything changed. Wren forwarded it to me at 5:12 p.m. with a one-line note, saving this one. By 7 o'clock, Muddy Fork was running at triple its normal volume. By 7:30, it had topped its banks at the upper reach and was moving across the low ground in a broad, shallow sheet, the kind of flooding that doesn't look dramatic from a distance and is absolutely relentless up close. The breach where my dam used to be was a 7-foot wide open channel, the raw clay edges already beginning to slump and widen. Horace sent me a text at 8:03 p.m. with a photo attached. Standing water in his crawl space, an inch deep and rising. Below the photo, just 2 words: "Here we go." I put on my rain jacket. I stepped out onto my porch. I could see the lights in the houses below, warm yellow rectangles in the dark and the rain, and I could see the water moving between them in the places it had never moved before. I stayed on the porch. There was nothing left to do but watch and document that and wait for the water to find its secondary path. Dr. Okafor's hydrology report had predicted 2 things. The first was sheet flooding across the lower tier of Harrowfield Estates. That started around 7:30 p.m. Water in Horace's crawl space, standing water in 2 garages on the east cul-de-sac, a shallow stream running across the road that wasn't there this morning. The second thing the report predicted was the secondary overflow pathway. This is the part Constance's board had never read, or never understood, or never believed. Muddy Fork's natural topography doesn't just send water downhill in one direction. At high flow, when the primary channel overtops, there's a secondary contour, a gentle swale running east along the upper edge of the development, that becomes an overflow route. My dam had been redirecting that secondary flow for 40 years, keeping it controlled, keeping it away from the upper tier of the development. Without the dam, the secondary path was open. The water found it at approximately 9:20 p.m. I know the time because I was watching the trail camera feed on my laptop when the overflow reached the swale and began moving east with the quiet, purposeful determination of water that has finally found where it was always supposed to go. It moved through the dark and the camera's night vision, gray and white and utterly indifferent. And it took 20 minutes to reach the upper tier of Harrowfield Estates. Constance Aldridge Plum's lot sits at the base of that swale. Her colonial, the 6,200 square foot one at the top of the hill, the one she'd been looking down from for 6 years, sits at the lowest point of her lot, where the landscapers had graded a gentle depression for the lawn drainage. Beautiful landscaping, extremely well irrigated, as it turned out. By 10 p.m., she had 14 inches of standing water in her basement and lower level, the finished rec room, the wine cellar with the temperature-controlled storage, the home theater with the in-wall speakers, and the projector she'd mentioned at HOA meetings more than once. A neighbor called 911 at 9:58 p.m. Fire and rescue arrived at 10:17, and a local news crew that had been monitoring the scanner for flood activity, it had been a slow news night, showed up at 10:31, camera rolling, reporter in a rain jacket standing in the street. I was on my porch when the news van pulled up. My porch is high and dry. I had a rain jacket on and a waterproof folder in my hand and a thumb drive in my jacket pocket. The county engineer, a man named Daryl Bryce, who I had spoken with twice on the phone during the drainage review process, arrived on site at 11:04 p.m. with a field crew and a utility truck with a light bar. He walked the perimeter of the flood area with a flashlight, and when he reached the breach where my dam used to be, he stopped. The machine-cut face of the earthen breach is unmistakable to anyone who knows what they're looking at. It's not an erosion failure. It's not a natural washout. It's a clean, deliberate excavation, the kind that leaves specific marks, a specific profile, a specific angle that no rainstorm produces. Daryl Bryce looked at it for a long time. I walked over and introduced myself. I handed him the thumb drive, trail camera footage of the demolition, time-stamped, 2 angles, and the waterproof folder, Dr. Okafor's report, the Article 14 Covenant Clause, the lis pendens filing, the county's own open drainage review, and the HOA attorney's 4:47 p.m. email declaring the matter resolved. He read the hydrologist's report in the rain, holding his flashlight at an angle, while his crew took field measurements around the breach. Constance was on her front porch, wrapped in a foil emergency blanket, watching this happen from up the hill. Fire and rescue had gotten her out of the lower level before the water reached the hardwood floors in the main living area. Barely. Daryl Bryce looked up from the report. He looked at the breach. He looked up the hill at Constance on her porch. And then, with the specific tired patience of a man who has spent 30 years watching people create preventable disasters, and then acts surprised when the disaster occurs. He said, "Ma'am, this is going to be a very long week for your board." The news camera was running. The reporter asked if I'd like to make a statement. I said, "I just want my neighbors to know they were right to trust the science." Then I went inside and made coffee. Travis was already at the kitchen table. He looked up when I came in, read my face, and nodded once. We didn't say anything for a while. We just listened to the rain slowing down. The week that followed was, as Darrell Bryce had promised, very long for the board. Greene County issued an emergency stop work order against the HOA within 48 hours and billed Constance's board $34,000 for emergency drainage remediation, temporary erosion control, sandbag deployment, road drainage repair. The county also opened a formal enforcement proceeding against the HOA for conducting land disturbance activity without a permit during an active drainage review. That's not a fine. That's a legal record. Wren's temporary restraining order was granted the following morning. Moot in terms of saving the dam. The damage was done, but legally critical. The TRO established in court record that the HOA had acted in knowing violation of their own covenant, an active county review, and a formally filed legal notice. All three, simultaneously. The Missouri AG's investigation, the one Travis had been quietly building since spring, escalated within 2 weeks into a full civil rights inquiry focused on the disparate enforcement pattern against the East Cul-de-sac families. The shed permits, the fence denials, the timeline discrepancies. The documents were all there. Travis had made sure of that. 3 of the 4 board members who had signed the demolition authorization resigned within 10 days. The 4th, Gerald Pike, who had dissented on the enforcement vote, who had been saving emails in a folder for 2 years, stayed on. He became acting board president. The first thing he did was formally rescind every outstanding violation notice Constance's board had issued in the past 18 months. The second thing he did was call me. "I should have pushed back sooner," he said. "You pushed back when it counted," I told him. Constance filed an insurance claim for the flood damage to her lower level. Her insurer denied it. Her homeowner's policy, like most standard homeowners' policies, excludes flooding caused by the alteration or removal of existing drainage infrastructure. Her attorney, reviewing the policy language against the documented timeline, reportedly told her this was going to be a significant problem. It was. Wren filed a civil suit on behalf of my family and 6 neighboring families, including Horace, including the East Cul-de-sac families, for property damages, legal fees, and injunctive relief. The HOA's management company, Pinnacle Property Solutions, settled 4 months later for $112,000. The settlement was divided among the affected homeowners, with one portion designated specifically for the permanent recording of a formal drainage easement on my property. A legal document filed with the county that means no HOA board, now or in the future, can ever touch that structure again. The following spring, I rebuilt the dam. Better this time. County engineered, who donated a full day of his time without being asked. The smell of fresh concrete curing and warm spring air is one of the better smells there is. I'm not a sentimental man by nature, but standing there watching those kids ask Dr. Okafor questions, while Muddy Fork ran clear and purposeful through the new spillway, I'll admit, that felt like something. The neighborhood coalition we'd built during the dispute formally incorporated as the Harrowfield Watershed Stewardship Group, a 501c3 nonprofit. Their first initiative was a scholarship for a graduating area student pursuing a degree in civil or environmental engineering, funded partly by the settlement, partly by a fundraiser Horace organized in his driveway, with a borrowed smoker, a cooler of cold drinks, and enough pulled pork to feed the entire East Cul-de-sac twice over. We named the scholarship after my father. He built the original dam 40 years ago and never asked for anything in return. Seemed right.
There's something about Daniel Thornborough's story that sticks with me. It isn't that he won, it's how he won. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't swing a fist, he didn't chase her down that easement with a pitchfork. Aileen Whitmore lost her HOA presidencies, her husband's commission seat, her fake family brand, and her freedom, not because a man got angry, but because a man got accurate. That's tonight's lesson. Petty authority collapses the moment someone shows up with receipts, cameras, chips, timestamps, spreadsheets, and the quietest tools in the garage turned out to be the sharpest. Alien thought she was up against a grieving old widower. She was up against 42 years of family roots and a precision agriculture engineer who understood that the truth is just data you bother to record. And at the same time, Daniel didn't keep the money. He planted it, a scholarship in Margaret's name. First generation farmers, a true community pick day. That's how real neighbors fight back. If you live through something like this, drop your story in the comments. We read every single one. Subscribe for the next, a retired Manning's koi pond, an HOA safety review, and what happens when the wrong board messes with a veteran.